Hi, today we're here to update you on some recent developments in the Kransky trial. Uh, Yesterday, we had some testimony from some very good testimony from the plaintiff's perspective from an individual named Randy Kilburn. Randy Kilburn is the product director for the DePuy ASR and was during the time period that it was on the market and subsequently recalled. What was interesting about this is that there have been lots of DePuy executives who have testified in this case, and very few have actually come to Los Angeles to testify in person. This is one of these cases where the defendant's executives, if they live outside of California, the plaintiffs cannot force them to come to California to testify live. And so any witness that comes to California does so voluntarily. So what the plaintiff's attorneys have been forced to do for most of this trial is play videotape deposition testimony from these witnesses, which is not nearly as good as actually having the witness there live. But for some reason, DePuy decided that Mr. Kilburn would be somebody who would testify live. Very, very effective cross-examination of Dr. Kilburn occurred in this case. The lead attorney doing that cross-examination, an individual named Brian Panish, who's one of the best trial attorneys in the country, did an amazing job. Started off the testimony by actually playing the videotape of Mr. Kilburn testifying in his deposition. So before he took the stand, he played a snippet of Mr. Kilburn testifying. And during his deposition testimony, Mr. Kilburn was asked some very simple questions about patient safety and advertising. For example, he was asked, isn't it true that patient safety is the most important thing at DePuy? And in his deposition, he gave these incredibly evasive responses and refused to answer the question. What is clearly a yes answer, he refused to answer yes and gave these evasive, long-winded answers and never really answered the question despite it being asked multiple times. He was also asked whether it was DePuy's policy and procedure and whether it was important to not mislead doctors in advertising. Just a general question. That clearly calls for a yes. It's our policy not to deceive doctors. Mr. Kilburn in his deposition did a terrible job responding to that question. He refused to answer it. It depends on what you mean by accurate. Those kinds of evasive and terrible responses. So Mr. Panish played the videotape for the jury, and then next thing you know, Mr. Kilburn's sitting there live, and he asked the same questions to him live. And this time he learned his lesson and said yes to both questions, whether patient safety was important and whether advertising needs to be complete and accurate. And so it was a very interesting setup for the courtroom. The testimony on cross-examination that Mr. Panish got out of Mr. Kilburn was great. So he went through several documents related to Mr. Kilburn's efforts to sell the hip. And what's great is there were a lot of PowerPoints, presentations that Mr. Kilburn used at big sales meetings with other DePuy salesmen. And one of them that was a big focus of the testimony was a PowerPoint. The title was "The Next $1 Billion," and basically it was a PowerPoint about the ASR and the other hip products that DePuy sells, and really trying to motivate the sales force to increase their sales by $1 billion. The PowerPoint also had lots of damaging information for DePuy, lots of encouragement for DePuy to be ruthless, for the salesmen to be ruthless in getting sales. There were PowerPoints dealing with what DePuy perceived to be the biggest threats to their business, and the biggest threats were bad publicity about metal-on-metal hips and bad publicity about metal ions. Those were perceived threats to their business. There was also testimony about how much DePuy sold, and really there was a lot of discussion today about, or I'm sorry, yesterday about the fact that there are billions of dollars being sold of these hips, and there's a huge incentive that DePuy has, and that Mr. Kilburn and the other people have, to keep the product on the market. What Mr. Panish was doing is really trying to set up the punitive damage part of the case, showing that DePuy acted with reckless indifference, that's the legal term, towards its customers, and put a product on the market that it knew to be defective and knew had problems. The other thing that he talked about was, and Mr. Panish keeps setting up, the plaintiff's lawyer, Mr. Panish, keeps setting up what you can see is going to be the closing argument, which is going to be red flags. The theme is going to be red flags, that DePuy had red flags and they ignored the red flags. He asked Mr. Kilburn multiple times, wouldn't it be a red flag if you found out that some of your key surgeons and customers stopped using the DePuy ASR for safety reasons? He had to say, yes, that would be a red flag. And then he proceeds to show him emails from several doctors, prominent doctors in Europe, who stopped using the hip before it was released in the United States for safety reasons. The other thing he talked about was one of the red flags would be if a design surgeon or a designer or engineer at DePuy told him that there were safety problems with the design of the hip. And he had to admit, yes, that would be a red flag. And then he proceeds to show him a report that was done by a bioengineer, Mr. Hunt, showing that he had serious concerns about the hip and its design and the fact that it could lead to excessive wear and tear. So you can see this theme of red flags being set up. The other thing that we see is interesting, and this has happened with a lot of witnesses, is DePuy continues to insist in this trial that the ASR is not defective. And that's important because that's one of the elements that the plaintiff has to prove, that the hip is actually defective. And the thing that keeps coming back to haunt them every time they say that, every time one of their witnesses says it's not defective, is a report that was done before the hip was recalled. And it was a report that had lots of engineers. It was done by lots of engineers and safety people at DePuy. And the report concludes that the hip is defective. It can cause injury, and that's why it's being recalled. And despite this report, this official document at DePuy continues to insist it's not defective. And that same sort of battle occurred with the testimony of Mr. Kilburn yesterday. He would continue to say it was recalled because it wasn't meeting expectations, and Mr. Panish would show him the document that says, well, right here it says it's being recalled because it's defective, and it was very difficult for Mr. Kilburn to explain around the black and white document that says the product's defective. So today was probably the best day so far for the plaintiffs. There was the cross-examination was excellent. Mr. Kilburn looked very, very uncomfortable throughout the day. Looked like he wanted nothing other than to get out of that courtroom and go home to his family because he was just being demolished left and right. So we'll see what happens, but I think the next phase of the trial, which begins next week, is going to be Mr. Kransky is going to be testifying. We've heard some testimony from his daughter earlier in the week, but we're going to hear from him himself and what he went through next week. And the plaintiff should be resting probably next Tuesday or Wednesday, and we'll see how things go.